Hello, welcome to the Authors Club LitLunch online for April. My name is Schüler, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce this month's guest, Ariana Neumann. She is the author of a family memoir, When Time Stopped, about her father's experiences during the Second World War. It was shortlisted for the Wingate Award and is out in paperback this month. Ariana grew up in Venezuela, where her father was an industrialist, a philanthropist, and an art collector. But during his lifetime, she knew nothing whatever about his previous experiences before he emigrated from Czechoslovakia. It was only afterwards, when she discovered a box of documents, that she began to research his life and discover what he'd experienced, and also discover the lives of her grandparents, who she never knew. Welcome, Ariana.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's lovely to be here and a wonderful introduction, so thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. You start, interestingly, with a discussion of antique watches. Which of course, in a way provides your title, When Time Stopped. Would you like to say a little about that?
Of course. So, my father was a collector of things. He was a collector of art, but he was also a collector of watches, and he was absolutely obsessed by his watches. He had, I think, if at last count, there were 297 of them, and he had a special room in this house in the tropics in Caracas in Venezuela, where I grew up, which was dedicated to his watches. And it was a little bit like a workshop. It had all sorts of tools, minute tools, of course. And he it was under lock and key, and he always carried the keys around in a keychain around a belt loop in his trousers. So it was impossible to get into the room unless obviously he let you in or unless he was inside. And whenever he was in there, he would be absolutely absorbed fixing these watches. And we spent a lot of time, my father and I, talking about watches. And because he was not a very emotional man, a lot of our relationship was spent, well, discussing politics and art, and sort of current events, or discussing watches, really, or solving puzzles and mysteries. But watches were one of those things that linked us. So watches always remind me of my father, regardless of whether they're pocket watches or wrist watches. It's just always, they connect me to my father. And because this book ultimately is really about him, I thought it was important to start it with watches and with time, which is, of course, what the book is about. It's a little bit of a time traveling. I mean, your marvelous book is also a journey, but yours is much more physical. You go across Europe. I sort of go backwards in time.
Thank you. You towards the beginning, it's also something of a detective story. And early in the book, you recall how, as a child, you organized your school friends into a detectives club to investigate mysteries. And that, in fact, gave you your first inkling of your father's previous life.
That's right. So when I was a child in Caracas, Venezuela, I grew up as an only child. And in those days, without the internet, what children did when they were alone was read. So I read and read and read. I was a voracious reader, and I loved Agatha Christie's, and I love Enid Blyton. And I was completely undaunted by the fact that I wasn't in rainy England. I thought that's what I want to be. I want to be like the Secret Seven or the Famous Five. I want to be one of these detectives. And I rounded up some cousins and some friends, and we started this book club. I'm sorry, not this book club, this detective club. We also swapped books. Actually, we swapped mystery books, but we started this club at the back of this luscious, beautiful tropical garden that was my house really, and we would meet there on Saturdays, and we would spy on people, and we were just desperate for a juicy mystery to solve. And we led very protected, pretty mundane, boring lives in the Venezuela, the 70s and 80s. Um, so we just looked at everyone that was worked in around the house and or that lived in the house, and tried to will a mystery to come our way. And one of those Saturday afternoons, I had a marvelous cousin. I have a marvelous cousin. He's a lawyer now, so not a detective, sadly. Um, he reported that he had seen my father move a box from that room where he repaired his watches, and that he had moved that box as if there was something inside that was really precious, perhaps a treasure. And I waited for everyone to go that afternoon. And I went and found that box, and it was exactly where my cousin had said it was meant to be. He said, Father put it by the chessboard, and there it was. There was the box, and I found it. I was incredibly disappointed that it clearly contained no treasure. I could tell because it was light. But I'm a good detective, so I opened it up and I thought maybe I'm going to find something else inside. And there were some very boring papers, but among those boring papers was this remarkable ID card. And I say remarkable, it was just a pink ID card. I've actually got it here for you if I should sort of show it. I've got sort of a box, or at least a box. I'm not quite sure it was the same one from 1980. But the ID card was, there we go, was that. And it was
Oh my goodness.
small. And I don't know if you can sort of see it there, but my
Yes.
father was much more wrinkled by the time I came along. But I recognized his eyes. He has these really distinct eyes. And all I knew really when I was growing up was that my father was from Prague. And this actually said Berlin. I don't know if you can see it there, but stamped Berlin Weissensee sort of there.
Yes.
And that made no sense. And of course, the stamp of Hitler was jarring. But what really, really made no sense was the fact that my father's name was Hans Neumann. And that card, I don't know if you can see it there,
Yes.
says Jan Sebesta. And I turned it around, and everything else pretty much seemed to be accurate, except for the date of birth, which was off by a couple of months. And I was just terrified. I mean, I found this and I thought, this man we're living with, he's an imposter.
Mm.
And I think that might give you a sense of the relationship I had with my father, where I sort of, instead of thinking, okay, what's he playing at? I immediately ran to my mother and I said, this man that we're living with, this strange man who's obsessed with watches, he is not who he says he is.
Mm-hmm.
His name is not Hans Neumann. So my mother immediately reassured me and said, don't worry, he had a difficult war. He had to pretend to be someone else. And I knew that he had emigrated to Venezuela in 1949.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always told that he had emigrated because the communists arrived in Prague because Europe was broken.
Mm.
Really. So I didn't really associate his emigrating to Venezuela with that difficult war or with that ID card. But anyways, so I cast that aside, mostly because my mother said, listen, he cannot talk about it. It's very painful. So don't ask him too many questions. And, she didn't seem particularly worried about this. So I immediately thought, okay, I shall, I shall not. I won't ask many questions either. But that was my first clue that there was a mystery to my father.
And well, firstly, thank you so much for sharing that card with us. That's a deeply precious item, and really appreciate the fact that you were willing to share that. It was only after his death that you rediscovered that box.
It was. So he was a collector of things, as I've said, but he didn't just collect art and watches. And he collected. I mean, he kept every single scrap of paper. He was a very meticulous man by the time I met him, and he knew he was going to die because he had had a series of strokes. He was still in Venezuela, and in 2001, he died in September 2001. I went down to Venezuela, and I was prepared. I was his only surviving child. I was prepared to spend days, weeks sorting out through all his papers. And I was very surprised to get there and find that everything had been cleared out. So all the papers, all the sort of roomfuls of files were empty. And there was just one drawer which contained a couple of little folders and then this box again. And it was the same box that I had found as a child detective, except when I had seen it, it had 3 or 4 papers in it. And now it was just crammed with documents of this man, Jan Sebesta, this man who my father had to pretend to be between 1943 and 1945 in Berlin. So that's what sort of set me off on this journey. I mean, at least that was the beginning of me acquiring a proper set of clothes. And it was, I think, the first time I felt that I had my father's permission to really ask the questions. And of course, by then I could no longer ask him the questions, but at least I felt like I had his blessing to go ahead and really solve the mystery of what happened to him during the war.
Yes, you do. You mention in the course of the book a cousin of yours saying that in a way he by leaving you those documents, he'd given you permission to ask the questions that he was unable to answer in his lifetime, things that he couldn't talk about. Could you tell us a little more about what you subsequently discovered?
Yes.
Quite an absolutely extraordinary story.
Well, it's interesting because I grew up really thinking that it was my father and his older brother, and I obviously knew that my father had parents, and I knew they were called Otto and Ella, but I didn't know anything about them or about the family that he had left behind in Prague. And every time I had asked any question at all as a child, it was just met with either a wall of silence, or if I really pushed, he would start to shake. So that was it as far as I was concerned. Um, my family was Czech. It consisted of 4 people, and actually, the word Jewish was never mentioned in my respect until I was 17, and that was by a complete stranger who came up to me at Tufts University, where I was doing, where I did my first years of university, and someone came up to me and said we should meet because we're both Latin American, we're both good looking, and we're both Jewish, and I was completely astounded by this. And I said, right, you're really not good looking and I'm really not Jewish. What do you mean? And he said, but we are Latin at least. And he said, you are Jewish. And I said, and you're basing this on? And he said, well, first, you look Jewish. And second, your last name is Jewish. And that was sort of the first time anyone said that my last name was Jewish. And it was it sounds ridiculous, but my father's never spoke about religion, so I didn't know really anything at all about where he came from. And when I did ask my father, and I relayed the conversation with my friend, my Mexican friend Elliot, who is about my being Jewish, my father said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, he said that we had Jewish blood." And when I said that expression, my father's voice at the other end of the phone immediately changed, and he said, "You will never ever use that expression again. That's what Hitler said about us." And obviously, I then had a clue that the family was Jewish, but it wasn't until he died and I started. I traced people all over the world. I hired a wonderful person in the Jewish Museum in Prague who helped me find everybody in the different archives, that I discovered that my father's family consisted not of 4 people, as I had thought, but of 34 people. So the Neumann family in Prague, before the war, there were 34 people. My grandfather had 7 brothers, one of whom had emigrated to California some years back. And it was just a huge, vast family. They had a paint factory called Montana, which was surprising because actually that was the name of my father's factory in Venezuela as well. And so that was a slightly strange thing. And those 34 people were, well, just, normal middle class Czech Jews, some more practicing, some more assimilated, who lived a relatively normal life until the Nazis came to power in 1933, and then eventually, by the time they arrived in the Czech Republic, and their lives changed completely. Um, and by the time the war was over, um, 25 of them had died. But what was wonderful about my journey was not obviously discovering their horrendous fate, but rather discovering their wonderful lives before this horrendous fate, and being able to find hundreds of documents and material and actually marvelous letters. So one of the things that I found, and is possibly the thing that I treasure the most, really, are these letters that were snuck out of. It turns out my grandfather and my grandmother were deported to Theresienstadt in 1942, and they lived there for 2 years. And with the help of a marvelous woman called Stenka, who was a Gentile, who organized a system of contraband of parcels that were snuck into the camp, um, we got these incredible letters out of the camp from them, and they're beautiful because they're uncensored, and they're letters from two people in their 40s and 50s who were addressing their children who were outside of the camp and who they thought they might not see again. So it's a wonderful window into their souls, and I was able to get to know these grandparents that I had never been spoken about, and obviously that I didn't meet. But it was a wonderful journey, and not only did I find my grandparents, but I also found all these cousins of
Yeah,
some slightly more outrageous than others, but all very vivid. And all these letters started arriving from different family, it turns out, in California and in France and in Teplice and in Israel and in all sorts of places. And It's just been an absolutely marvelous, very life affirming journey.
incredible. Yes. One of the things that puzzled you about
Mm-hmm.
your father's fake ID card was the fact it was stamped in Berlin, of all places. Uh, there's a Czech saying that you quote in the book: "The darkest shadow is beneath the candle." Could you say a little more about how he came to be there? And
Absolutely. So I have to tell you that the original title of the book was the shadow beneath the candle, and my British editor loved it, and my British agent loved it, and my US editor said no, too complicated. We need to swap it. So we eventually swapped it, but it's really at the heart of the book is this saying, the darkest shadow is just beneath the candle. And you have to imagine this. It's 1943. My father has now been called for transport 3 times, and he knows that they cannot save him again. So he is going to be transported probably to Theresienstadt. He has letters from his parents who are in Theresienstadt saying, do whatever you can, but avoid coming here. So armed with those pieces of information, one of his cousins, who's more or less his age, was killed in Auschwitz in 1941. So he knows that he needs to avoid being captured by the Nazi net. And when the transport notice comes, he does pretty much a pretty crazy thing, which is he absconds from a transport and he goes into hiding. He goes into hiding at the paint factory in Prague, and the building is still there. And it was quite incredible to be able to sort of walk through it and find where my father was in hiding for 2 months. And when he's in hiding there for 2 months, his best friend, who's this Czech guy called Gentile, who called Stenik, who was with him in chemistry school, that he comes in at night when the factory, of course, is empty and it's just my father there. And Stenik had been sent to work from Prague, where he was from, to Berlin. So even though he was not Jewish, and I'm sure, obviously you know this, but they were all sent. Young men were sent all over the Reich to work for the war effort. Stenik had gone to a paint factory, and he was bemoaning the fact that actually he had a lot of work. And the reason he had so much work, actually, quite horrifically, was because a lot of Jewish workers had just been deported to camps further east. But Stenik says, Hans, if only you could come and help me. And they had been in chemistry school together. So, and they were actually boy pranksters, really. And any knowledge that they acquired from chemistry school, seem to be dedicated more to sort of producing stink bombs and things like that, rather than any anything serious.
Mm.
And Seneca joked, "If only you could come." And my father and him is inspired by the saying, "The darkest shadow is just beneath a candle," which basically means that if you're going to hide anywhere, you don't hide in the periphery where the light of the candle is going to give you up. What you do is you go to the most unlikely place, really. You go to the center of it all, where the center of the candle, where the shadow is really at its absolute darkest. And there, no one will find you. So I think you have to be 22 and you have to be pretty crazy, and the circumstances, you have to know that you shouldn't be transported.
Mm.
And you have to think, okay, I'm going to be found. The Gestapo are looking for me. I've absconded from a transport. I am on their wanted list. They're looking for me in Prague. And then you have to think, okay, so what am I going to do to fool them? Because he is, after all, him and Stenik are boy pranksters. So what do? They decide that the obvious place to go and hide is to go to Berlin, and actually not hide at all, but to just pretend that he is another worker, a bit like Stenik, except he goes there voluntarily rather than forced, and he finds a job in Berlin at the same paint factory, manufacturing lacquers for rockets and for the Luftwaffe. And there he goes in May 1943, armed with Stenik's passport, a fake ID under this name Jan Sebesta, which was a completely made up identity, and a vial of cyanide just in case he's found. So that's how he ends up in Berlin, and where he manages to hide or not hide actually, to live for 2 years in
Quite
the belly
openly,
of the beast.
and even to have an affair with the wife of a German soldier.
Yes. Well, I think there were. I mean, I gather from my father's account and from other books that there were quite a lot of women in Berlin, and quite a lot of widows in Berlin. And my father was a 22-year-old who was, trying to pretend he wasn't who he was, um, and he was trying to eventually acquire some information. So I think the you know being charming with the secretaries at the company really paid off.
You talk about acquiring information and mentioned that the factory was actually making lacquers for aircraft and missiles. That's where the Dutchman comes in.
Yes. The Dutchman. Actually, it's been marvelous to write this book, because there are still some mysteries, and the Dutchman is one of them. And but here, let me just tell you about the Dutchman before I tell you about this marvelous phone call I had the other day. So my father, who actually couldn't talk about any of this, after some pretty horrendous times in his life in the 1990s, decides to write a little bit about his experiences during the war, and he leaves them, or in Berlin, and leaves them in the box for me. So I have a dozen pages of this, and in them, my father talks about the Dutchman. And this Dutchman was a forced labor in the company that my father was working with, which is called Barneke and Bohm, and actually the company still exists today. And this Dutchman basically approaches my father, because my father, not being a forced labor, had access to much more sensitive material. And my father was quite had charmed his way into this sort of, I don't know, a sort of more important job really than his experience warranted. And he had a boss called Dr. Hogan, and Dr. Hogan obviously didn't know he was Jewish. He was an ardent Nazi and liked my father and gave him access to all this information. So the Dutchman says to my father, if you signal me in the lunchroom, we will meet after the factory closes, and we can walk, and you can tell me a little bit about what you find, so that we together can help stop this horror that is happening. Um, and then my father, actually, one of the things again that he leaves me in this box is this document about um, that he was working on about these experiments in Peenemünde. And again, I didn't I had no idea really if they were passed on to anyone other than this Dutch person, if they ever were of any use to anyone. But it's quite a remarkable thing to do in the middle of Berlin when you're pretending that you're not, a Jew with all your family in concentration camps, to then add another layer of danger to that, which is to pass off information
To
to
the
an,
Allies,
yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm.
So, but it was so I was just going to say what was quite remarkable is that this marvelous Hungarian man that I had met a few times who knew my father and he is quite a picturesque character and he must be in his late 80s now, called me the other day and said, "You should have asked me. I know who the Dutch
Wow.
student is." And I went, "Really?" And he said, "Well, all I can tell you is that he's not Dutch
Mm-hmm.
at all, and he wasn't a student really. He was a British agent." Now, that might be a further book, perhaps, but I obviously that's sort of new material, and
So you've only
again,
just
I
discovered
have
this.
my sources, but it's just wonderful that you do research, you think you solved the mystery or most of the mystery, and then you're still getting little clues a couple of years after you've written it.
Astonishing. Yeah. And then after that, as the Third Reich falls apart, your father then returns to Prague.
He does. He returns to Prague as Jan Sebesta, and he eventually gets his identity back, really. And I think he has to prove who he is, and he comes back, and in June 1945, and he marries his girlfriend during the war, who helped him by helping him, well, by literally giving him her ID so that they could doctor it and he could go to Berlin with it. Um, and so he comes back, he marries her, he tries to rebuild his life slowly as people trickle back from the camps. He realizes that his parents have not survived, and neither actually have most of his cousins and his uncles and his aunts, and most of the family is gone. And only four people actually come back from the camps. Um, and he eventually, in 1949, decides that, I think he decides in 1948 really, that he just can't stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And with the help of two of his uncles, actually, that one of whom had the one that had gone in 1919, and then another one that had managed to emigrate right before in 1938. He crafts a plan and decides that the place that they should move to, him and his brother Lothar, is Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they do, with pretty much nothing except a few, a few documents and a little bit of money from his uncles in America. They start a paint factory in Caracas, doing exactly what it is that the family did in Prague.
Mm-hmm. And after all those decades of silence on the subject,
Mm-hmm.
how did learning all of this affect you? I mean, it's these are huge things to discover about your closest relatives, really.
Yeah, they are, and it's one of those things where it's still affecting me, and I think the repercussions are just so enormous. It's almost impossible to sort of sit here and say, "Oh, I was like this, and now I'm like that."
Mm.
The knowledge is sort of it's both empowering and shattering.
Mm.
Um, in and on the one hand, the horror of what happened to my family is could actually be completely overwhelming, but at the same time, their strength and their resilience, and the the heroism of
Mm.
others around them that helped my family survive. And if they didn't help them survive, it all depends where where one ends things, right? But I mean, if you help them, if you think of how they help them live a little longer or make their lives a little better, it's actually quite a marvelous story. It's filled with light, and it's filled with, well, with
Mm.
heroism, with everyday heroism. and with love and light and resilience. So on the one hand, it's just devastating, and on the other hand, you think, actually, there are kind people doing the right thing all around,
Yes.
and they certainly were around my family. Obviously, not enough, but sure, certainly enough to keep them alive for a little longer, and that was wonderful to find. And the other thing that is um, was really quite wonderful was the sort of, the resilience of people, and how humanity prevails even in the horrendous circumstances of Theresienstadt,
Hmm.
where people are, starving to death and dying of horrendous diseases. Um, it's incredible how my grandparents still managed to find joy and laugh and find reasons to be happy and to maintain hope
Mm.
despite it all. So it's quite empowering at the same time. So it's been it's been just a crazy journey, and I'm still absorbing how it's obviously changed completely my sense of identity. Um, so I'm still Venezuelan, and
Hmm.
I'm still a little Czech, but I'm now all of a sudden a lot more Jewish.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, totally. Well, I
So,
think we're probably approaching the end of our time slot. I just wanted to ask one more thing, and that was the research clearly took you about 20 years. At what point did you suddenly realize that you would have to write a book about it?
whew, you know, I always wanted to write a book. I always wanted to write books. I always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a detective, which I'm happy to say I think I am. And the writing bit, because I have all these degrees in literature, I think if you read great books, it's very difficult to write
Hmm.
at all. Forget even writing great books, but you just are very self-critical. At least I'm very self-critical. So I never thought I could write well enough. But as I pieced all these stories together, and these marvelous characters, I call them characters, but they really are people, emerged, and these beautiful stories came to light, two things happened. One is I realized that if I didn't tell their stories, the stories would just remain sort of veiled in the silence. And um, and then also I realized actually that what really matters is not just how well you can write, but the stories that you tell. And that the stories that you tell are much more important than the way you tell them, I suppose. So I tried to tell them, and I tried to tell the stories in a way that was readable and that was not awful gibberish. Um, but it really is about the stories, and it's a book really about the people behind the stories, and it's a way of keeping them alive as such. But I think that realization was very slow, and it happened around 2016. So if you think that my father died in 2001, and the book became a book in 2000, I think beginning of 2018, it really, it was very late in the process
Yeah.
where actually someone said this has to be a book, and I went, yeah, yeah, my husband always says that it should be a movie, and I
Mm.
said, no, no, it really has to be a book. Um and lo and behold, they put me in touch with someone who said we'll publish it.
Well,
So
thank you. I'm very glad.
so am I. I'm still, I'm pinching myself. I just can't believe
Yeah.
it's been translated into all these languages, and that it's
How
coming
many
out.
languages has it been translated into now?
Yeah, I haven't counted, but very random ones. So sort of, Spanish
Czech, I hope.
and Spanish. Hmm?
Czech, I hope.
Czech, yeah. So Czech, it's come out in
Mm.
Czech, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Finnish, Chinese.
Wow.
Not German actually, which was
Mm.
a disappointment. Well, you never know. I suppose we might find one,
Yeah,
might still find one, but I thought Finnish and Chinese were pretty impressive.
absolutely. Yes.
So
Thank you so much. I can heartily recommend the book, which is compulsively readable and uh, and profoundly moving. So I would recommend it to anyone. Thank you so much, Ariana. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And I wish you every success with the paperback edition and further translations.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a joy talking to you.
And you.
Talking to you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much.